All right, so I'm in a college class right now where we're focused on like how can we design different, basically universally designed for learning and like blended learning, right? How can we kind of design that in our classrooms and like the benefits and whatnot. So in this class we have a book, okay? So that book is called UDL, Universal Design for Learning and Blended Learning, okay? So honestly, this is a fantastic book, and it really breaks down some barriers that some hesitation some teachers might have, right, with switching kind of to a more blended learning style. But it does a great job. It talks about different research and different ways that we can kind of improve our teaching as teachers. And honestly, like, I love this. It really opened up. Well, I loved it because it talked about like the backbone of like why we should do things differently, et cetera, right? Just like I had mentioned earlier. But it also does a good job giving you examples and testimonials and whatnot. Like, it's just a whole all-in-one package. Okay, so what I wanted to do is kind of go through my notes from each chapter, and I'll just bring up a couple main points that I really liked and then just like quickly discuss them. So this is gonna be a little bit longer of a video, but I will have it broken down on YouTube so you can click and go to the different chapters that I'm talking about. Okay, so that's my introduction to this book, and it's fantastic. It's by Katie Novak and Caitlin R. Tucker. Okay, but yeah, it's super relevant to how we need to change our schools currently. So yeah, let's get into it. So chapter 1. Okay, so a couple main points that I really liked. First off, the average student is actually a myth. Okay, so we get caught in these. Okay, so for example, Utah. Okay, so we talk about, so like spring is probably my least favorite season in Utah. And it's funny because you look at like the average temperature in, let's say, like March, right? And the average temperature is like, oh, you know what? This is actually pretty nice. It's a nice day every day, right? It's 70 degrees or whatever the average is. And it's funny because then, I mean, I'm not a math teacher, right? So I don't remember what the verbiage is. But basically, if you look at the average, like if you look at the actual temperatures over the month, right, it tells a completely different story, right? Because you get some days that are like, it's 40 degrees, it's 30 degrees, and then like random days where it's like 90 degrees, and it's just like all over the place. So it's not just an average good spring day every single day, right? And so I think that happens in our classrooms very frequently, where we just like categorize different students into different areas, right? Like, or compartmentalize, right? So like I've got my A students, then I have my B and C students, then I have my D and F students, right? And like that's just like they're in different categories, and that's the average student, etc., right? And so then I base my planning and my learning and everything off that, when really every single student has a different background, different history, everything. So I love that. I also loved it talked about that the kids we're teaching now, they have no idea of what pre-streaming TV was like. Okay, so they controlled what content they were watching, how fast they watched it, when they watched it, where they watched it, right? They control that. And so their whole life is built on that principle. And so it's pretty funny if you think about it. And it helps change our mindset from like, hey, I'm the TV, I'm the program of the day, scheduled to always play at 5 p.m. So if you're not here from 5 to 6 p.m., then you're not going to get to see what I have to offer, right? And that's kind of the old mentality versus like, you know what? We can set it up the way that these kids are used to, which is I can choose what I'm watching, where I'm watching it, when I'm watching it, how fast I'm watching it, right? Like if we can set up our classroom like that, it's going to really connect to our students better. And then the other point that I really liked in this chapter was, in UDL, we don't make judgments about our learners based on labels, but we have high expectations and believe all of them are capable of success when we provide pathways and empower them to determine what they need at any given point in time. Okay, so basically, like, we know what each student's potential is. We set it high, right? And every student's going to be different. It's not going to be the same one size fit all. But then we also have to provide them different pathways to get there, right? So if they're going from Salt Lake City to Florida, somewhere in Florida, Tallahassee, I don't know. But if they're going from point A to point B, like they need pathways to get there, right? But it can be different pathways. It doesn't have to be the straight shot, right? It can be different pathways to get there, and students will prefer different ways. And then they also need the support, right? So they need to know how to get there, what direction to go. Maybe they're going in the wrong direction, and so we got to correct them. Okay. But yeah, like that chapter was very powerful to me. And it talked about like a birthday party, a ski birthday party someone had planned, right? And like they thought everyone was going to go skiing and have a good time, but like only some of their friends went skiing. Other friends wanted to just hang out at the cabin. Other ones wanted to go like sledding or like snowball fight, like they all had their different things they wanted to do, but they all still had a good time because they were able to do what they wanted. And so like sometimes we have to release control a little bit as teachers, and that's kind of like was like the purpose of that chapter. So really enjoyed that chapter. Okay, moving on to chapter 2. Okay, so a couple points I really liked. So first off, equality versus equity, right? What does that look like? So equality, basically giving everyone the exact same opportunity. Like I have so much attention to give. I'm giving every single student the exact same amount of time. Every single student has the exact same test available, the exact same instructions, therefore it's equal, right? And so for a long time, that was kind of the standard, is like, well, everyone's getting equal stuff, so that's it. That's the end game, right? Versus like equity, right? So like, how are we removing these barriers, right? And so one of my favorite, I guess it was like a political cartoon or a cartoon or whatever, and it shows like people trying to watch a baseball game, and so there's the different heights of the people, and the fence is set at a certain height, and so the tall person doesn't even need a box, a medium-sized person only needs a little box, and the short person needs multiple boxes, right? So like equality would be, we're going to give every single person one box, so it's equal, right? Everyone's getting one box, and so the tall person who could already see over the fence is now seeing over the fence more, like significantly higher. The medium person can barely see, if not at all, and then the shortest person with one box can not see at all. Like it's just like they're still below the fence, right? And so like the idea is that with equality or equity, we can really just remove that fence, right? Like make it a see-through fence, a clear fence, and then now everyone's able to see the baseball game, right? And so really like figuring out how are we going to adapt to each student's needs, right? And every student's going to need different levels of stuff, right? So in one of my classes, maybe a student needs me to give them special attention 5 to 10 minutes of the class, right? And so like, how can I design my class where I'm not taking away from those who need more from that, from me, or they have more potential, right? It shouldn't ever just cap off like, well, once you're here, you're done. No, like every single student should have the different things that I set for them. So the other idea is like, how can I create a buffet of resources, right? So I really just need to have so many different types of resources and lots of resources and different varying levels of resources, right? Scaffolding resources. And how can I create my assignments and projects to kind of have all these buffet of resources for the different students that I have? Okay, one of my classes that I am taking talked about the idea of like micro histories. Okay, so every single individual has a different basis of history, and this is why they think a certain way, this is why they do certain things, right? It's because they have completely different backgrounds. And so it's important that as teachers we recognize that, right? So like, for instance, me, like I had a very supportive family growing up with high expectations for me for school, and that was like, that's my reality is created based on all of my experiences and histories with school, right? Someone else might not have that. And so we just have to really recognize that every student has different micro histories, right? Different histories that they have dealt with. And that's what creates the truth for them, right? Their own truth. And so like, how can we really just recognize everyone's micro histories and really make changes based on that? Okay, so those are some points I liked in chapter 2. Chapter 3, okay? So like, how can we become a design thinker for our classroom? Okay, it's no longer the day where I stand up in front of the classroom and I'm the gatekeeper of knowledge and like I tell you what you like need to hear and you write it down and then it's yours forever. No, that's not how it works anymore. We need to really become design thinkers. Like, how can we design different styles, different things, different assignments, different projects? Okay, so 3 different points or 3 different ways that we can become better design thinkers, right? We got to focus on user outcomes. Okay, so again, we got to focus like if we're going from Salt Lake City to Florida, I've got to focus on like the Florida, right? That's my end goal, right? So I've got to kind of backwards plan from there. So focus on the user outcomes, right? So like the user outcome in this case would be going to Florida. But what does that look like in my classroom? Okay, having diverse, empowered teams, right? So utilizing my team. So like I teach financial literacy, and so I need to be able to utilize my 3 or 4 different team members, like, and being diverse, and like, right, we all have different ways that we've learned and different things that we teach, different styles, and so really combining to make a super robot. Okay, and then constantly reinvent, right? Restless reinvention, like, okay, this worked really well, what can we do to replicate that more with other units, right? Or this didn't work well, so let's throw it out, let's start with something new. Okay, constantly changing, right? So it's very tiring as a teacher to constantly be doing that, but when you're working with your peers, it definitely helps. Okay, I love the idea in this chapter of a communication choice board. Okay, so like, how are my students communicating to me that they have learned something? And a communication choice board gives them different options, like, hey, you can communicate it to me on what you learned with a YouTube video, or you can do this or that, or write an essay, or whatever that looks like. Okay, so that was a cool idea. Also, this is the point, it also talked about, this is kind of what I mentioned on chapter 1 that I really like, but students really need to have control over time, place, and pace of their learning. Okay, again, if we were just standing up in front of the classroom from 7:30 a.m. to 10 a.m., you're listening to me, I'm talking at you, you're getting the information, and that's the only time you can learn in my class, right? You're writing notes, and then you'll just remember everything I've ever said in my life, right? Like, that's just, it's not realistic. Students need to have the control over the pace, the time, and the place. So I'm making sure that we have our classroom set up like that, or our schedules. So that was a good chapter. Chapter 4. Okay, so I mentioned this earlier, but teachers no longer are the gatekeeper of knowledge, right? You're not the only way that people can get information, right? And again, it's hard because, especially maybe some more old school teachers, like, it used to be that way. Before the internet, before like not Wikipedia, but before, all these different resources that these students have, like, the only way I was going to learn anything is by you, right, as the teacher or the professor. But now, like, for instance, I just installed a sink in my house, and like, guess what? I watched a YouTube video, and then I did it. And like, I didn't need to go to anyone to like learn this skill. Like, it's out there, the information's out there. So really, our job is like, how do we like help teach you how to learn properly? Okay, self-directed learning, okay, needs to be a thing. Universal design of learning talks about that, right? But self-directed learning is a great tool, right? It's based on the user needs, right? So like, there might be a student that I'm like, you need to complete 3 or 4 of these assignments because I know that you can. And there's another student that might be like, hey, we'll just work on this one assignment, right? But the self-directed learning, like helping them just like figure out, like creating that passion, helping them create that passion, and then just go for it. Video-based instruction. Yes, so video-based instruction, right? It talks about like, how do we activate prior knowledge, and then we show them whatever the short video, and then like reflect on it afterwards, right? So there's a process to it, but like, there's no reason for me, if I'm talking about the same information in my classes, then there's no reason for me to just stand up there every single time. Why don't I record that video, and then we can have different engaging activities, plus students will be able to reference it later if they want. Okay, so video-based instruction, these students are a lot more visual nowadays, right? That's why they like Instagram and TikTok, is like, they're so visual. And so when I stand up there and there's a PowerPoint where it's just words, right, over and over, like, that's not gonna get them anywhere. And then also utilizing group-based learning. Okay, so using the group-based learning, helping students be able to work with like small groups and kind of learn from each other, right? And that's kind of like a facilitator, right? Is like, my job is to help you like ask the right questions, answer the right questions, and kind of get a discussion going, right? Students are going to learn way more from that setup than me standing up there just talking at them for an hour and a half. Kind of like I'm talking at you for an hour and a half. Just kidding. Chapter 5, okay, talking about facilitation, right? Facilitated learning versus directed learning. So I love the whole story with Benny the pigeon, right? And like how there was a pigeon that just showed up one day, and then, come to find out it was like someone's actual pet, and they were like training it. And so it's so fun, right? That's such a fun idea. But really, it's like, I'm a coach to you. I'm working with you individually, okay? And because I'm working with you as an individual, you're going to reach higher potential, right? Because I'm like working with you. It's not a one size fits all. Again, this can be draining a little bit, so you got to be careful. But like, if you set up your classroom in the right way, it's not going to take much more effort, and you're going to have stronger relationships with your students. Okay, so part of this is making sure that you promote participation. Okay, so what I found is one of the best ways to promote participation is helping students see why they need to learn this. Okay, so it's easy for me because I teach financial literacy, and so all I do is like, we're going to talk about money, we're going to talk about buying a car, going on vacations, like but the point is you still got to activate, like, this is why we're learning this. Okay, and then you ensure equity, right? Making sure that every single student has a fair, like, what they need, right? All the resources they need, you got to make sure you have that. And then lastly, you got to build the trust, right? So for me, like, I give real world examples from experiences I've had, right? So I talk about something, I say, this is what I did, I screwed up this way, that way, right? Admitting my mistakes and that I'm human. Students love that, and they're going to engage and have that trust with you and actually participate. Okay, making sure that we're coaching in the classroom, right? So just like a coach, what a coach does is they see you do something wrong, they stop, they tell you why you did it wrong, how to fix it, work with you a couple times, and then now you get it right, and then, okay, cool, time to move on. So like, how can we do that in the classroom, right? How can we be coaches in the classroom? And then making sure that we're promoting feedback as students work. So just like actively as they're working versus, oh, you took a test 2 weeks ago, here's the corrected test, this is what you missed, right? They're not going to remember, right? They barely remember what they ate for breakfast. So like, if you're waiting to give them the feedback later than currently, then it's not going to be very effective feedback. So like, finding ways to make sure that we're giving active feedback as they're working. Okay, chapter 6. Some points I liked in chapter 6. Students need to share responsibility for their learning. Okay, so again, I think activating prior knowledge, but also like teaching them why we're learning this is going to help them take responsibility for why they're learning, right? Because if they just feel like they're only learning something because either A, they're being forced to, or B, it's just for some test, then what's the point of them actually learning it, right? Like, it's one of those temporarily, they put it in their temporary memory, right? Versus their long-term memory. Okay, so part of this, you got to make sure that they figure out what their goals are, right? What are their goals? They've got to create that metacognitively. They've got to figure out what are their goals, and help them like figure out how to create goals too, right? Secondly, where are they at currently, right? Where am I at now? They need to be able to figure out, based on this goal, this is what I'm trying to get to. If I'm trying to go from Salt Lake to Florida, then how do I figure out where I'm at, right? Because if I'm all the way up in Washington, not Washington, D.C., because that'd actually be the right direction, right? But Washington State, if I'm over there, like, I'm in the wrong direction. Like, I've got to go somewhere else, right? So you've got to help them figure out where they're at currently. And then after they get to Florida, like, what would they do differently next time, right? So maybe it took them a while because they went here and then here and then here. So like, what can they do differently next time? Okay, talking about meta attention, right? How are students' awareness of their goals, right? How do we create the awareness of their goals? And I think at the core, like, students need to have that passion for like why they want to achieve this, right? I think that's super important to activate. Ongoing self-assessment, right? That's super important, like figuring out where they're at, helping them figure out how to figure out where they're at. Instead of just like, I'm telling you you're right or wrong, like help them think through, like, this is why I'm right, this is why I'm wrong. Okay, and then I love this piece, like helping students identify their growth over time. Okay, so like, what's their growth over, like maybe they do a project on what they understand about financial literacy at the beginning of the year and what they understand at the very end of the year, and then letting them look at that and kind of see where they went, right? That's going to really help activate some wheels, some cognitive wheels going. Some crazy eyes. Okay, chapter 7. Okay, some things I liked in chapter 7. Effective assessment practices support better communication of learning between students and teachers. Okay, so that's how we create an effective assessment practice, right? I think sometimes teachers get caught up in the whole, it has to be multiple choice, it has to be X, Y, Z. Really, all an assessment is how are students communicating what they learned to me as a teacher. Okay, and the book talked about this, but most students don't see it that way, right? Most students see it as just high pressure, my grade matters, like that's all that, and it kind of, what's it called? it makes it so that like there's such high pressure that they stop actually like focusing on what actually matters, which is what they've learned, and they start focusing on the wrong details, right? Like, I can't get this question wrong, or I've got to do the best on this, or whatever, right? So how do we kind of activate that so that students don't see tests as that way, or assessments? Okay, finding alternative paths to engage students to show what they're learning throughout the class. Okay, so finding different ways. It doesn't need to be multiple choice anymore. It can be multiple ways that a student can communicate to me. Different pathways, right? In order to go from Salt Lake to Florida, you don't only have one path. There's lots of different paths students can take. And it also has to be like actively throughout class. It shouldn't just be like the end of the quarter, like show me everything you've learned, right? And because that creates, again, a high stress, and it doesn't necessarily communicate what you want them to, right? If I'm redoing my kitchen and putting a sink in, it shouldn't just be, okay, I'm starting without a sink, and then all of a sudden the very end is like, oh, I put the sink in. Well, it's the wrong direction. It's upside down. It's this, it's that. Like, well, it's the end, so I guess that's all I learned, right? No, it has to be actively showing what you're learning throughout the class. Okay, what do learners need to know or be able to know, right? Kind of backwards planning. Like, you've got to figure out what should my learners be able to do at the end of this class, and then working backwards through there. And then how will both the students and I know that they can do it, right? That's, again, the backwards, like, how can I know that a student has understood what we've just learned, right? So it doesn't have to be multiple choice. In fact, I hate multiple choice because multiple guess, right? Like, once I see the right answer, I might like click and I'd be like, oh, that's the right answer, versus like open-ended. Like, that's the way I want students to be able to work. Okay, chapter 8. Some things talking about the core of teaching and learning is based on relationships. Okay, so I have an experience. Well, last year I had a class with about 22 students, right? It was an elective class. I had a little bit less than like a high number of enrollment, right? But that class was one of the best ones. They did great. They learned really well. Like, their projects were always like on point, but it's because I was really able to work in small groups and with individual students, right? And I made it a goal in that class. Versus one of my other classes, I had 36 students. It was really hard to keep up with all of them, right? As far as relationships go, like, and it was also during 8th period or 4th, or one of the last periods of the day. So there was a lot of athletes that were in and out, and it was just like, it was really hard to create relationships in that class. And it was probably one of my worst performing classes on like state tests. And so really, like, again, at the core of teaching and learning is based on relationships. Okay, and that's not just with students, it's also with your peers. Okay, so being able to create strong relationships, and that helps build your support system, but also helps you just like feel connected and feel a passion for teaching, right? Especially when you're in the room with the right people. I've been taking a lot of professional development classes lately, and it just really, like, you get inspired, right? You get inspired when you're with other people that have those same passions and are doing new, cool, innovative things, and hopefully I also provide that for them. Like, they hear something that I do and they're like, oh, that's really cool, and then they get motivated. Okay, so basically chapter 8 talked about PLCs being gold, right? Professional learning communities, and being able to work with, like, maybe you have a set time for lunch for your group, or you like get out to go grab coffee with everyone. And it shouldn't only be focused on just like professional development. It can also just be like, hey, creating like some strong bonds, right? Some positive relationships. Okay, and then the last chapter, it actually tied in really well with one of my other classes that I'm taking, but it talked about institutional barriers that parents might have or families might have. Okay, so again, going back to microhistories from one of the previous chapters that I talked about, like, historically, my family, right, like, we really cared about school. I've had supportive parents. They made sure that I was able to go do extracurricular activities. Like, I had a very different experience with school than someone else might have. So it's important that we recognize that, and like, some families might not be comfortable with the way that schools are ran or have been ran, right? Like, maybe there's a parent who had really bad experiences. They were maybe always being suspended and their teachers didn't care about them, or that was what they perceived, like, and then over time, like, that's how they look at school now. And so when their kid is struggling, instead of going and contacting the teacher, right, they might just like pull their kid out of school for a couple weeks, right? Or whatever that looks like. So it's just important that we remember there's institutional barriers, right? And so, like, for instance, parent-teacher conferences, that's something that, like, I used to get super frustrated with. I'm like, why aren't anyone coming to these? Like, and it's Zoom, so anyone can do that, right? But there's these different barriers that have been created over time. And so it's important that we recognize that and just know that we can kind of help out and find ways that we can help out. Okay, and then also co-construct learning experiences. Okay, so work with your peers, but also work with parents, right? So reaching out to, maybe you're having an issue with Johnny, like reach out to Johnny's parents via phone call, right? Or like maybe even set up a meeting to go and meet at Johnny's parents' house, right? Whatever that looks like, to kind of co-construct learning experiences. So for instance, with financial literacy, that's an easy one for me to partner up with someone, right? I go and talk to parents and be like, what is something you wish you would have learned, right? And then after that happens, I can be like, okay, so I'm gonna teach your student about that, but I need you to also teach your student about that, right? So creating these partnerships, I think, is super important, okay? Overall, fantastic book. Definitely would recommend to anyone, new teachers, old teachers, right? I think it has a lot of really good points to really like change. It's funny, so kind of ending on this point, but like thinking about like the car, right? Car's first invention, it had the wheels, the four wheels, an engine, the pistons would fire and the wheels would move. And really, if you think about it, over the last, however long cars, 80 years, 100 years, I don't know, however long cars have been around, they really haven't changed that much, okay? And I think it's the same thing with schools. Schools really haven't changed that much, and so books like this really will advance the way that students can learn and how we can be effective teachers. So thanks for coming to my summary of the book. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and I definitely recommend reading it. So take care and stay out of trouble.